you as we have just 1 week remaining in the regular season. It's been a weird year.
Yeah, it has been a weird year. Not as weird as last year, all the weird COVID stuff we had going on. It's almost been odd to return to normalcy. But even so, I mean, just some of the storylines, some of the wild swings in this season, and certainly you guys can attest to that in the state of Mississippi. It has been weird. It's been weird.
I wanted to ask you specifically about your tweet from Sunday afternoon. I tried so hard not to quit Ole Miss this year. Hung with them, then finally gave up when they lost their 4th straight series to fall to 7-14 in the SEC. Now the Rebs are about to clinch a road series at LSU to get to 12-14. RPI moving on up, very much alive, quite a rally. How alive is Ole Miss right now in your mind?
Yeah, they're good. I mean, after that tweet, they wound up sweeping that series. So, I mean, they're sitting pretty now, 13-14, RPI in the 30s again. I mean, really, you got a home series left against A&M. The way I see it, they win 1 game and they just waltz into a regional. If they win that series, then you might be playing your way up to a 2 line, rather than just being a 3 seed. So, yeah, they're right now. Like, we did our projections again today, and in our discussions last night, they weren't even on the bubble. They're just back in, just like that. Sweeping that series at LSU really changed their fortunes, especially since they'd beaten Southern Miss midweek. They had swept the previous weekend in Missouri. I mean, it's a 7-game winning streak. They got real momentum right now.
Kendall laid out a scenario on Monday, and it kind of raised my eyebrows a little bit. He said, if they were to win the series against A&M, and then were to play their way to Saturday or Sunday of the SEC tournament, then there is a scenario where you're talking about Ole Miss in the host conversation. Is that a bridge too far?
I think it's going to be hard to get there. I mean, I could see it. If they swept A&M, first of all, that would get them over 500 in the league, right? That's a position of a little bit more strength rather than starting at 15-15 heading into Hoover. Then you really need to make sure you win more games than you lose in Hoover. But the problem is there's just so many teams they'd have to jump that have better RPIs. I mean, even teams like Georgia and Vanderbilt that are just 14-13, it's not like they got some great conference record, but they're top 10 in the RPI. So in order for Ole Miss to pass those teams in the pecking order, you got to go a long way because you're not going to catch them in the RPI. And you're probably not going to, get much past them in the standings. And so I just think there are too many SEC teams probably that they would have to leapfrog. I mean, you've also got Arkansas, you've got A&M, and you've got, Tennessee. I mean, there's just so many teams there that I would still have ahead of them in the order, right? I think they're ahead of LSU right now. So there's one team that they've passed, but I just think there's still too many they'd have to jump over.
Let's talk about Southern Miss for a second. You had them 3 weeks ago as a top 8. And then they fall into that 9-16 range. They sit there for a couple of weeks, and then they fall out of that after losing back-to-back series. And now they're on the 2 line on the road in your projections. How far away are they from being the number 16 or the number 15?
They're right on the edge, really. And, we wound up sticking with Gonzaga for that 16 spot based on, if you look at the RPI models, we expect Gonzaga's RPI will jump back up into the top 16 if they can win their last series on the road at San Diego. Now, they might not win that series, first of all, and if they don't, then they're not going to host. Even if they do win it, I mean, they're right there next to Southern Miss. It comes down to which flavor of mid-major power, suits your fancy. And in Gonzaga's case, the thing that's going for them is they swept the series on the road at Oklahoma State, which is just louder than anything else that most of these teams have done. And they've been so consistent all year long. Southern Miss did stumble a little bit. They had a couple of bad weekends there late, but overall body work is still good. I mean, they're still going to win their league probably by a couple of games, still have a RPI in the teens. Like there's lots of things going for them. They're kind of competing for a spot with maybe Georgia Southern, Texas State, Gonzaga, those kind of mid-major powers. I'd all put in a clump competing for maybe 1 or 2 host spots.
Oh, that's what I was going to ask you. I mean, you mentioned Gonzaga first. So is it either or with Southern Miss Gonzaga, or I mean, let's say Gonzaga, wins that series with San Diego. Southern Miss wins at Middle Tennessee. They get to Sunday, or they win the Conference USA tournament. Is there a road to both of those teams potentially hosting?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, it's not an either-or proposition. And, there's a bunch of ACC, SEC teams that we've got in there right now that aren't necessarily slam dunks. I mean, even Arkansas, as great a year as good a year as they've had, they're 17-10 in the league. Usually you think, all right, this team it's a slam dunk to host. But I mean, their RPI is in the mid-20s.
Yeah.
If they don't finish strong, you could see them falling out of it. The ACC, you've got a bunch like Florida State and Virginia. They're just kind of hovering there around the edge. Maybe Notre Dame could fall back. I mean, there's plenty of teams that aren't necessarily secure there in those Power 5 leagues that could fall back.
It's really interesting when you look at the SEC teams that are either in the hosting conversation or securely as hosts. You've either got a record problem or an RPI problem. I mean, outside of Tennessee, really, I mean, they check both boxes, right? I mean, number one in the RPI, best record in the SEC, slam dunk, number one seed overall, regardless of what happens. But, I mean, you look at Auburn. I mean, they got 15 SEC wins, but the RPI is off the chart. I mean, you mentioned Arkansas a second ago, 17 SEC wins, but the RPI is just very so-so. So what is the committee going to do? I mean, are they going to rely on RPI the way they have in the past, where it's basically 1 through 16 with maybe a couple of exceptions, or are they going to look at it differently this year and go, yeah, but this doesn't make sense?
This feels like a year where if the committee is doing their jobs properly, and that's a big if, they will look a little bit beyond straight RPI this year, because I mean the Big 12 is a great example. The two teams at the top of the Big 12 are Texas Tech and TCU. They're both in the 30s in the RPI. Now, the way the committee has been doing their fields lately, they're not giving any hosts to teams in the 30s. I mean, really, it's almost been straight RPI, like the top 16, 18 teams. That's your pool of host candidates is how it has seemed lately. And so, but are you going to not give the Big 12 champion? Or in this case, they could be co-champions. They could tie for that regular season title and both be in the 30s. I mean, how could neither of those teams host? And so if you've got that kind of opening the door for looking beyond straight RPI, I think you'd also have to take that same approach to other conferences. And all that said, I mean, if you're Vanderbilt and you're sitting there with a number 3 RPI and you go 16-14, you're probably going to host. If you're Auburn, and you're top 5 in the RPI and they win their last years at Kentucky, they'll be 17-13 or 17-12. They're going to host. So there are still examples of teams where the record in the conference is good enough combined with an elite RPI. Those are still no-brainer hosts.
So I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, the two most interesting series this weekend in the SEC are Texas A&M at Ole Miss for a lot of reasons, and LSU at Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt trying to be a host, maybe play themselves into a top 8. LSU trying to, I don't know what LSU's trying to do right now. Is there anything I'm missing besides those two series that really grab you this weekend?
Not really. I think that's the correct answer. Yeah, A&M, Ole Miss. I'm really curious to see if Ole Miss can keep this thing rolling. I think they will. I'm picking them to win that series at home. Just think they've got it figured out right now. And then, yeah, I mean, LSU, it's just a weird team. I mean, I think we all know who they are. They're a team that can score a lot of runs and doesn't pitch or play defense very well. That's just who they've been all year long. And at this point, it just kind of seems like they are who they are. But for them, they're just playing, I think, to get some momentum and find themselves into a better groove heading into the postseason, because I don't think they're going to host at this point. I mean, I guess they could go to Vandy and win that series and make a jump in the RPI, and maybe they're back in the hosting race in that big glut of SEC contenders, but it seems unlikely.
Aaron, the thing that's a little less fun to talk about, but is a reality in this sport, is that you got conversations about the postseason, and then you got conversations about teams who should be in the postseason, but they aren't, and therefore they're talking about making coaching changes. When you look across the SEC landscape, how many do you see this year?
Probably 2 or 3. I don't like speculating about this stuff. I mean, we're talking about coaches' livelihoods here. I mean,
yeah.
I just don't like talking about it until when they're open. We can talk about it. We'll talk about candidates, but you guys know. I mean, you guys know the jobs that are, the hot seats that are out there. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist. But yeah, I think 2 or 3 is probably what we're looking at.
And I wasn't going to try to pin you down on the jobs. I was just kind of curious the number when you look across the landscape. Yeah. And I don't know. To me, I feel like baseball is more like that than any other sport. I mean, in basketball, we're talking about hot seat jobs. In football, we're talking about hot seat jobs in like September. It's a little bit different deal in baseball, so we'll see how it all plays out. Aaron, great catching up with you. It's been far too long. Hope to talk to you during the postseason, and should be a fun next month, 6 weeks or so.
Yeah, you got it.